When you hear the walking embodiment of the dangers of proximity to whiteness and leader of the Conservatives in the UK say this:
Israel is fighting a proxy war on behalf of the UK, just like Ukraine is on behalf of the West of Western Europe against Russia. We have to get serious.
Does it spark something in your mind? Because in me, it immediately reminded me of this.
It's important to factor in that this is not just a war that Israel is fighting against Iranian proxies on its own behalf, but it is on behalf of Western liberal democracies like the United Kingdom and like the United States.
Now, this is Natasha Hausdorff, a lawyer that belongs to the UK Lawyers for Israel. And here, in front of a select committee in the United Kingdom, she's trying to yet again defend the indefensible, a genocidal ethno-state. But you will note that she's making the same argument that Kemi Badenoch is, but a bit more directly. She's hinting that Israel is doing the dirty work for liberal Western democracies, presenting itself as a bulwark against the barbarity of Iran. In 2023, Geert Wilders said that Israel is the West's first line of defense. In 2019, Herzl said that Zionism and Americanism are front lines of Western civilization and freedom in our world today. And even before that, José María Aznar, then Prime Minister of Spain, said that defending Israel is ultimately defending the Western roots, the Western values that many in Europe and some in America seem to have forgotten. And as we know, when these types of politicians say West, they actually mean white. But even they weren't the first people to actually use this. The first person who presented the potential state of Israel as a bulwark of West against barbarity was actually Theodor Herzl. In 1996, he presented the potential state of Israel in Palestine as a sector of the wall of Europe against Asia, serving as the outpost of civilization against barbarism. And this makes sense if you consider Herzl a product of his surroundings. He was a European man in the age of colonialism. And just because he was an oppressed minority in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in Europe in general doesn't mean that he hadn't absorbed the same contemptuous, transactional, exploitative approach to the rest of the world that his fellow Europeans had at the time. But the fascinating thing about this idea of Israel as a bulwark of the West is that it shifted throughout time. When, in 1952, in the occasion of the anniversary of the Nakba, or the establishment of the State of Israel, if you want to call it that, House leader John McCormack said that Israel was the most important bulwark of the free world in the Near East and a Near Eastern outpost of Western civilization, he was emphasizing that Israel's democratic armed forces formed a real barrier to communist imperialism. Because that was the way that the leaders of Israel at the time decided to market themselves to Western countries, specifically the United States, as a bulwark against communism. And as the last line of defense to the type of Arab nationalism that was expressing itself at that time in countries like Iran through Mossadegh, the resurgence of which would stop Western powers like the United Kingdom and the United States of accessing their vast oil supplies. They were able to keep this facade, a thing that in my mind, more than anything else, is the example of virtue signaling as a cover for what they were actually doing, violently colonizing Palestine, installing an apartheid state. Because you know who was also called the bulwark of Western civilization at that time? Apartheid South Africa, a country with which Israel had very close ties to. They were able to do that in Palestine because they leaned into a perception of Palestine and the East in general that was coined by the literary critic and political activist, the Palestinian American Edward Said, as Orientalism. This idea built up for centuries by Western countries of the mysterious and barbaric East. Something that throughout the later part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the French and the British would use relentlessly to exploit countries like Algeria, like Sudan, like Egypt, under the cover of trying to liberate them. But with the end of the Cold War, the discourse in Israel had to adjust. So instead of fighting a war against communism and Arab nationalism, Israel jumped into the bandwagon of what Noam Chomsky derided as the ideological cover for US expansionary foreign policy that was the concept of clash of civilizations. A concept developed by Samuel P. Huntington, a conservative thinker, that predicted that the next stage of fighting of the United States would be against the Muslims or the Confucians, and I wish I was joking. Flattening into three concepts in one go centuries of historical development, cultural achievement, language, and people. And that is the reason why the discourse that you hear from Israel at this moment and its defenders is much closer to what Herzl had to say to what Ben-Gurion had to say. It aligns perfectly with white supremacist and colonialist discourse, and that's why, while Israel exists, you're going to continue to hear this talking point. It is essential to their survival for them to lean into what type of bigotry the Western countries that they rely on for support has in vogue at that particular point. This just reminds me again of a quote by Edward Said that I'm going to paraphrase. Every empire tells itself and the world that it is unlike all other empires, that its mission is not to plunder and to control, but to educate and liberate. So remember that, and don't be fooled